and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be looking at my 2020 reading statistics, which I am very excited about. I love stats. I love watching other people do their reading stats videos, so I am super pumped to be doing my own. As you can see, I'm filming from a different location today. I'm going to be looking at my computer a lot, so I figured it was just easier to have it here in front of me because I have the numbers on my computer. So I'm filming from my kitchen today. So I'm going to go through some numbers and I'm going to compare some of them to my numbers from 2019 to see how things may have changed. So let's just do it. So first, I want to talk about the total number of books that I read in 2020. I ended up with 118 books, which is like incredible. I never thought I'd get such a high number. My number for 2019 were 95 books. So I increased that number with like more than 20 books, which is like incredible. I am super happy with how many books I read. For the number of pages that I read, my 2020 number was 42,233 pages. Compared to 2019, my number then was 37,219. So I read like 5,000 more pages in 2020, which again is like incredible. That's a lot. Super happy with that as well. And then let's look at average pages per book, because that's changed a little bit. In 2020, my average pages per book was approximately 351. I'm saying approximately because this is according to Goodreads. And on Goodreads, I try and use the edition that I actually read, but sometimes I can't find that edition, so I just pick another edition. So the number could be slightly off, but I think it's fairly right. So 351 pages per book approximately. In 2019, that number was 392. So like 40 pages more per book. That does make sense to me, which we're going to look at a little bit further down, because I just read bigger books in 2019. I read more romance basically in 2020, and those tend to be shorter. So this number completely makes sense to me. And then let's look at average rating. According to Goodreads, my average rating was 3.5 stars. This is probably not quite right. I mean, Goodreads doesn't use half stars, and I do. So when I add books on Goodreads, if I give a book 3.5 stars, I will usually give it 3 stars on Goodreads. So that means that I assume that this number is a little bit too low for what my actual average rating is. It's probably a little bit higher, but still, this is like pretty high. I don't love every single book I read, but this is a pretty good average rating, I think, especially considering this is probably a little bit higher. And then if you look at books by month, my best reading month of 2020 was April, when I read 14 books. I read a lot of romance that month, I remember, so I read a lot of shorter books. If you look at pages, my best reading month was actually January, where I read 4,378 pages. So I had a good start to the year, which again makes sense because I remember wanted to catch up on a lot of series that month, so I read a lot of like bigger fantasy type books. So that completely makes sense to me. And my worst reading month was actually September and October. I read 7 books in both those months. And if we look at pages, September was my worst month. I read 2,708 pages in September. And if you look at what type of books I read, I read 68 books that were standalones, and I read 50 books that were part of a series. So 57.6% standalones and 42.4% series. And when I saw that number, I was like, I read a lot of series. Like, a lot of the books that I read are part of series. It was actually way more than I expected. I mean, it makes sense because I'm trying to prioritize series, and once I start a series, I try to like continue and stuff, but still, 50 books that were series, that's a lot. And then let's look at genres. So the genres that we're going to look at are based on the spreadsheet that I use. The spreadsheet, by the way, I got from Heart by Quarter here on BookTube. I will try and find the video where she talked about the spreadsheet and link it down below. If it was up to me, I maybe would have categorized the genres a little bit differently, but we're just going to go off how it is on the spreadsheet. So in 2020, I read 4 classics, I read 26 contemporaries, 2 dystopian, 5 fantasy, 4 graphic novels, 6 historical fiction, 8 mystery, 4 non-fiction, 9 paranormal, 25 romance books, 7 science fiction, 1 short story collection, and 7 thrillers. So if you look at this, my most read genre is contemporary with 26 books and 22%. Very closely followed by romance with 25 books and 21.2%. So I mean, I have tended to think of myself as a fantasy reader, but according to this, I'm actually way more of a contemporary and romance reader. But like, if you think about it, fantasy books are usually way longer. So I think that if you look at the number of pages that I read, those numbers will actually be more similar. Because I could probably read like at least 2, maybe 3 romance books for 1 fantasy a lot of the time. So, I mean, I don't think the difference is as much as it like kind of looks like. And also I can't read too much fantasy like right after one another. Usually if I've read 1 or 2 like bigger fantasy books, I need a bit of a break. And that's usually when I go to contemporary or romance. So, I mean, this makes sense, but I mean, maybe I should stop thinking about myself as primarily a fantasy reader, which I don't really do anyway, but like when people ask me about favorite genres and stuff, I usually say fantasy first, but I mean, maybe I should change that. I still read quite a bit of fantasy though. I read 15 fantasy books according to this, and 9 paranormal. I would probably put those 2 categories together. So if I did that, my number would be 24. So I mean, it's not that bad. And if you look at my 2019 numbers, they are actually kind of similar. It's not too much that I've changed. The one big change is that I've read more romance in 2020. I only read 6 romance books in 2019. And I read a little bit more fantasy in 2019. But again, that makes sense to me because I am pretty sure I read a lot of YA fantasy in 2019. And I got a little bit tired of those. So I've sort of on purpose read less YA fantasy in 2020, which I think is why my fantasy number is a little bit lower. So that were the genres. I'm happy that I'm reading such a wide variety of books. I try to do that. So, and there are some numbers that I would like to maybe increase a little bit in 2021. For instance, my non-fiction number. I only read 4 non-fiction books. And I enjoyed all of them. I usually enjoy non-fiction when I actually do read them. So I would like to maybe read a little bit more in 2021. So let's look at intended audience. So in 2020, I read 68 adult books. I read 49 YA books and 1 middle grade. I don't read a lot of middle grade, so that's not surprising. if you compare this number to 2019, this is, I think, where you actually see the biggest change in my reading. Because if you look at 2019, the numbers have actually turned. Because in 2019 I only read 37 adult books and I read 55 young adult books. So I read a lot more YA in 2019. This number, it's not surprising that things have changed, but I am surprised that they've changed so much. I have read less YA in 2020. I'm aware that I've done that. Like I mentioned before, I read less YA fantasy because I felt like a lot of those books were kind of the same and I got a little bit tired. And I've also tried to make an effort to be a little bit more selective, I guess, with the YA books that I read, because I found myself, like, I still really enjoy YA. If you looked at my favorites video, you will see that most of my favorite books of the year of 2020 were YA books. So, like, I really love a lot of YA books, but I find myself, as I read more and more YA, I found myself just feeling that a lot of them were kind of the same, and that I've read certain books several times before. So I've just tried to be a little bit more selective with the YA books that I decide to read. So I think you see that in these numbers. And I think we will probably continue to see that in my 2021 numbers. So yeah, this, I mean, it makes sense to me, these numbers, but I'm actually surprised at how much they have changed. So let's look at authors. So I read 30 books by male authors in 2020. I read 78 books by female authors. And I read 9 books. In the other category, I'm basically putting authors in those cases where maybe there are 2 authors of a book and it's one male and one female. And also in the cases where an author doesn't define themselves as male or female. So 25.4% male authors, 66.1% female authors, and 10.6% others. This is not very surprising to me. Over the last few years, I've usually read way more female authors than male authors. I assume it will probably stay that way. I don't know why that is. I guess I just tend to gravitate towards books written by female authors. Not intentionally at all, it's just the way it is. But like, I'm not unhappy with that. So my most read author in 2020 were, and this is probably not surprising to anyone, but it was Alice Oseman. I read 6 books by her. I think one of them was a reread, and the 5 others were the books that were new to me. And my second most read author were Cassandra Clare with 5 books. And then let's look at format. So in 2020, I read 55 books that were physical books. I read 38 books that were audiobooks, and 25 books that were ebooks. So 46.6% physical books, 32.2% audiobooks, and 21.2% ebooks. Now, I was kind of curious to look at this number because in 2020 I've worked from home since March. And I usually do a lot of audiobook listening on my commute, which obviously I haven't been doing a lot of this year. But what I have been doing more of this year is read during my lunch, which I don't normally do. So I read like half an hour during lunch every single weekday, which is pretty significant. So I assumed that the number of audiobooks that I read in 2020 would go down compared to the year before, and that the number of physical books / ebooks would probably have gone up. And that's exactly what have happened. So in 2019, I read 55% physical books, I read 37% audiobooks, and 8% ebooks. So the number of ebooks that I read have gone down with like 5%. So like it's pretty significant, but I wouldn't have been surprised if it was more actually, since I have been commuting so little. But what I have been doing though is probably, I think I've been hiking more in 2020 because I've just had more time to do that since I wasn't commuting. And I usually listen to audiobooks during hikes, so it makes sense that the number has gone down, but I guess it also makes sense that it hasn't gone down more than it has. And one of the biggest changes is actually ebooks. I read 21% ebooks in 2020 and only 8% in 2019. But that's just because I read more romance. Pretty much 100% of the ebooks I read are romance. So that is the reason why that number has increased so much. And the final numbers we're going to be looking at is star rating. So in 2020, I didn't read any books that I gave 1 star, but I read one book that I gave 1.5 stars. I read 10 books that I gave 2 stars. I read 6 books that I gave 2.5 stars. I read 23 books that I gave 3 stars. I read 16 books that I gave 3.5 stars. I read 32 books that I gave 4 stars. 16 books that I gave 4.5 stars. And 12 books that I gave 5 stars. So some of you may think that it's not a lot of 5-star books, but for me this is actually a pretty big number because in 2019 I only gave 6 books 5 stars. I'm quite picky with my 5 stars, I guess. So 12 is actually pretty high. I mean, I'm pretty happy with that actually. And like I had 32 4-star books and 16 4.5 stars books. So I mean, I think, looking at this, I think like half of the books I read were 4 stars or better, and I mean, I think that's pretty good. I usually try a lot of different types of book, and not every book is going to suit me or be to my taste. So the fact that like 50% of the books I read were books that I really, really liked, I mean, I think that's pretty good. So the number as a whole from 2019 isn't that much different from how it is, from how it was in 2020, except for the fact that I read more 5-star books. So yeah, that was the numbers that I wanted to go through. I'm just finding it so interesting to see how my reading is changing. And I guess as a whole, my reading, I find, hasn't changed too much, but it has changed a little bit. Like you saw, probably the most significant change were in the fact that I read more adult books now compared to the year before. I read more romance particularly, and a little less fantasy, which again, like I said, makes sense. And also I give more 5-star ratings. I mean, again, which I'm not unhappy about at all. I hope it continues that way in 2021. And I think just one of the reasons I give higher ratings now is because I'm getting better and better at finding the books that I think I'm going to really enjoy. So obviously I hope that I'll only give more 5-star books in 2021. So yeah, that was my statistics. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed going through these statistics with me. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye!